Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Disafemi History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. Welcome to Disafemi History Podcast. I am your host, Wendy Aris. In today's episode, we turn our focus to the Kalinago people of Dominica, one of the most resilient and enduring Indigenous communities in the Caribbean. We're honored to be joined by Mr. Crispin Gregoire, former United Nations Ambassador for Dominica and an advocate for Indigenous rights and cultural preservation. Together, we'll explore the deep history and legacy of the Kalinago, examining their ancestral heritage, governance, spiritual traditions, and the ways they've maintained identity and sovereignty through centuries of colonial transformation. This conversation shines a light on the living history of the Caribbean's first peoples and the importance of reclaiming Indigenous narratives in our collective story of the region. So sit back, relax, and join us for this insightful discussion on the Kalinago heritage, resilience, and identity with Mr. Crispin Gregoire. Crispin Gregoire, for coming on to the podcast and speaking about the Kalinago and heritage of Dominica. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes, my name is Crispin Gregoire. I am a national of Dominica, also a U.S. citizen, I should mention. I worked with the Kalinago people from 1984 to 1989 when I directed the Save the Children program in the Kalinago territory. And fortunately, that program was closed by the government in 1989. And after that, I left Dominica, came back to New York, and spent like 3 years here. Then I went to Nigeria for 6 years and worked in Nigeria with the Ford Foundation. And I later on, in the 2000s, I came back to the U.S. and worked in nonprofit governance. And then after 4 years, I was appointed as ambassador of Dominica to United Nations in New York. And I spent 8 years in that role. And it was during that time the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the final negotiations on the declaration were reached. I was very active in that. And then later on in 2014, I was working at that point, I was the director for the Caribbean at United Nations Development Program. And I was, seconded to the office of the President of the General Assembly. And my role was to organize, I was a special advisor to the President, and my role was to organize the World Conference on Indigenous People in 2014. So in a nutshell, that's pretty much my background. And most of my career has been in the nonprofit, non-governmental sector.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for that, Mr. Gregoire. And for those that are unfamiliar about who the Kalinago people are, formerly the Caribs, what is their significance in history of Dominica and, of course, the wider Caribbean?
Yes. Well, the Dominica Kalinagos have a special place in the history of the last 500-600 years because they have lived on Dominica since maybe about 1200. These are people who migrated from South America up into the islands, and they inhabited different islands. Of course, there were other tribes like the Taino, which we call Arawaks as well. The Kalinago were called by the Europeans Caribs. And but if we go back into the history, back in the 1700s, we will see that their real name was Kalinago. And so they returned back to that name not so long ago, maybe in the last 10 years, I believe. And they, what is significant about them is that they led a resistance against European colonization. And they and the St. Vincent Kalinago both resisted the colonization of Europeans, both French and English. The Spanish had claimed sovereignty over those islands, but they never really settled in the smaller islands. They tended to settle in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and that's where you had the Tainos. The Kalinagos were wiped out in the Eastern Caribbean as early as 1620, when St. Kitts was colonized, followed by Barbados, and of course later on Jamaica. They were literally slaughtered. But the Kalinagos of Dominica and the Kalinagos of St. Vincent waged a war of resistance that kept the Europeans out, and it postponed colonization for at least a century. So whereas St. Kitts was colonized in 1620, Dominica doesn't get colonized until 1760. And similarly, St. Vincent has a history that is similar to the Dominican Kalinago, except that the British in 1795 arrested all of the Kalinagos, or the majority of them, I would say 99% of them, exiled them to one of the islands in the Grenadines called Baliso, and in 1797 deported them to Roatan in Honduras. And that's how we have a population in Honduras, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and Belize. These people came originally from St. Vincent. But what is different between them and the Dominican Kalinago is that they had gotten thoroughly mixed with an African enslaved Africans who were brought to St. Vincent. So that is why the name sometimes creates some confusion. They call Garifuna, and that's the name they acquired when they got to Central America. And Garifuna means Black Carib. So now on Dominica, even after the colonization started in 1763 by the British, I must say that the French had already been in Dominica, but there was significant rivalry between the French and the English, and Dominica changed hands between French and English maybe 2 or 3 times. The Kalinagos at that point, once the colonization started, were kind of, they become a minority very quickly, and they were pushed from the west coast of Dominica to the east coast, which is the hostile Atlantic coast. And they were able to eke out an existence in a very small area, which is just about 5 square miles of land. They owned the whole island, and now at the turn of the last century, their numbers reached only 230 were left. And it is from there that their population has grown to what it is today, just under 4,000.
Okay. Wow, that's quite a bit of information there in terms of with the genocide, with the changes. And I guess, my next question is in regards to, I guess, further expanding on that. Is like, how has the colonial era for language and labeling, such as the term Carib, as you mentioned, impacted the perception, of course, the identity of the Kalinago individuals?
Well, under the British colonization, a number of things happened. First of all, they only had 232 acres of land, and then the British never recognized the tribal chief until maybe about 1900. When the then British administrator made a visit to the territory and made a report to the British Foreign Office that they should be given more land. By then, they had lost their language, And to this day, that language is not spoken. They know some words, but in terms of a spoken language, and they didn't really have a title to the lands that they occupied. Fortunately for them, that piece of land was one of the pieces of land that the British surveyors had not surveyed. They had pretty much left it to the Kalinagos. But the rest of the island was surveyed into lots, which was sold by auction to people in England. And the Kalinagos, where they settled in this place called Salibia, which is on the east coast of Dominica, northeast coast. And it wasn't until 1903 that the British Crown decided to follow up on the recommendation of the administrator. His name was Hesketh Bell, to give the Kalinagos 3,700 acres of land, which is what they have today. And it's slightly over 3,700 now. I think it's closer to 3,780 acres, because the government that was in power from 1995 to 2000, they had addressed one of the land border boundary disputes that the Kalinago have with neighbors, and they determined that that land really belonged to the Kalinagos, so they gave them 80 acres of additional land, and there is parliamentary approval for that.
Okay.
In terms of they had a quiet existence and didn't feature very much in the history of Dominica, even though they were still there. There's very little about them. But when we get from 1903 to present, they have been very much a figure. Well, they have a presence in Dominica's history. I should mention that there were certain events that happened after it was called the Carib Reserve. That was what the British called it then. And they recognized the chief, and the administrator recommended that the chief be given a stipend, so on. And the chief eventually established a council. But before all of that happened, I should mention an important event that happened in 1930, when the British claimed that the Kalinagos was smuggling alcoholic drinks coming from the French islands of Guadeloupe, and that they sent policemen into the reserve, and there was a scuffle which led to guns. Police used guns, and they shot some Caribs and who died, and the British declared war, and they sent a warship into the bay of Salibia, and they occupied Salibia. The Kalinagos were very scared by just the flares from the warships scared them, and they ran up into the hills, into the mountains, because part of their land is dense forest. But interestingly, just before that happened, there was a very devastating hurricane which had blown the leaves of all the trees. It may have even been a Category 5 hurricane. It's listed as one of the most devastating hurricanes that Dominica witnessed before the present ones, because since 1979, we've experienced Category 5 hurricanes. So the Kalinagos, from their vantage point in the mountain, they could see all the activities of the Marines down at the bay. And they stayed up in the mountains for days, until the British Marines pulled away, and there is, I should mention that there is a report of testimonials by Caribs. The British had sent, I think, 2 or 3 people to hold a hearing on that. And it was held at the public library in 1931. almost a year after. And so there are lots of testimonials there. One of the significant things that happened with that event was the chief. His name was Jolly John.
Mm.
He was arrested and detained and later on deposed by the British. They stripped him of his chieftainship, and then the British took away the whatever survey of the territory that was there. Not necessarily a title, but the survey, because it surveyed the whole place. And they kept that for a long time. It wasn't probably until the 1980s that it was returned to the British. They also took the staff of the office. There's an official, it's called a staff of the office. They took that as well. So all the accoutrements that go with the chieftaincy was withdrawn. And later on, years later, the British, believe sometime in the 1940s, they appointed a council and the chief. And it's from there that the Kalinago, it was called the Carib Chief and Council. They were the ones who were given the authority to govern the territory after the chief was deposed in 1930.
Well, and we're going to go now further, more recent times in terms of the significance of the Carib Act of 1978 and how did
Yes.
it, alter, I guess, the legal and the political status of the Kalinago people in Dominica.
Yeah. Well, one of the important things that I should underscore is that in the negotiations for Dominica's independence,
Mhm.
the Kalinagos really were not consulted. And much to the chagrin of the chief, the existing chief at the time, his name was Faustulus Frederick, he he tried very much to get the attention of the authorities, but either those who were in government and those who were in the opposition, but was not successful. And so their concerns were never taken into consideration. However, I should mention that this in the negotiations for Dominica's independence, in the British Parliament, there was a discussion about Dominica's future independent status. And questions were asked about what is the status of the Caribs. We're still calling them Caribs then. And then the government and the opposition, they realized that there was a gap in the total negotiations for independence. So the first thing that happened after the independence was achieved on the 3rd of November 1978, the very first sitting of Parliament, which I believe happened in that same month of November or maybe this early December of 78, the government passed the Carib Act as the legal framework for how the government will relate to the Kalinago people. And that act placed the authority for governing the territory in the hands of the Kalinago council and chief. And so that's enshrined in law. And so that this is the Carib Act of 1978. There have been, I think, one amendment since it was passed, and that is an amendment to increase the size of the territory by the 3,000, by 80 acres I mentioned earlier. So that's the only amendment they've had. Of course, one of the concerns, and we'll talk about that, but I just want to mention it. One of the concerns of the Kalinago people now is that they want that act to be updated and to be brought in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that is something that we'll see in the next couple of years, because this current chief is very focused on that and updating of that act. Frankly, the act is outdated.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess from that act, in your view, for the Carib Act, has it gone far enough in terms of the self-determination or sovereignty of the Kalinago people?
It doesn't. Because one of the things is that it doesn't give the Kalinago chief and council full control of the territory. As a tribal government, they have a certain distinction from other local government authorities. They are pretty much treated as a local government authority. That's the Kalinago Council and the chief. Now, that's the only local government authority in the country that has a chief and a council. In other places, it's just a council. The law, the Carib Act recognizes the authority of the chief as the leader of the Kalinago peoples and leader and chair of the council. I believe it's 7 members. The law prescribes a council of 7 members, including the chief, and all of them are elected for a period of 5 years. All of that is enshrined in that act. Now, to your question as to whether the self-determination had been considered, I would say no, because give you a good example of the limits of the authority of the council and the chief is that they have no authority to expel people who would intrude into their territory. Yeah, for them to, if anybody were to come to live there without the permission of the council has no legal authority to expel anybody. What the law calls for them to make a complaint to the minister responsible for local government, and that minister will be the one to solve that problem. And I saw it firsthand in 1987 when I was working there. The Kalinago Council attempted to expel some men who were living in the territory on the basis of having a relationship with a Kalinago woman. Mm-hmm. And they served notice on these men, and then the government, the central government, led by the Prime Minister at the time, Mary Eugenia Charles, said that that was illegal, and that sounded like apartheid, and she was not going to allow that to happen. And consequently, the council was reined in, and they had to yield. But I think the council did that because they wanted to show their displeasure with the act, that they felt that the act did not empower them. And so that, and here's the other part to this. At the time, I was the director of Save the Children, and we were running this program, community-based program in the territory. We were actually blamed for radicalizing the Kalinagos and making them feel they were different, and they were different ethnic group, and we were threatened then with expulsion from the country. And that's the American Save the Children. We were there for 5 years. In total, we were there for 5 years. But when that happened in 87, we were there from 81. So we were there like 6 years. And then this happened. And I was actually blamed for radicalizing the Kalinagos. And one of the things that they were opposed to was the fact that we were connecting the Kalinagos with other indigenous groups in North America, to start with Canada and the US, and later on South America. And then we also helped them to connect with their brothers and sisters in Guyana, not so much Suriname then, but small community in Trinidad and Tobago, and those in Belize and those in St. Vincent. So that was the beginnings of what I would call kind of a pan-Kalinago or pan-indigenous peoples of the Caribbean beginning to assert their identity. And Dominica is unique in the sense that in the islands, and it's really 3 islands that has strong Kalinago ancestry. You have St. Vincent and Grenadines, Trinidad, and Dominica. But if you go to the wider Caribbean and you add Guyana and Suriname, there are many tribes there. Like Guyana, each probably have like 10 or 12 tribes, including Caribs, and they have other indigenous groups there. But in the islands, it's Carib or Kalinago,
Hmm.
and the Dominica Caribs are the only ones who really have a territory, because what the British had established as the reserve, Carib Reserve in 1903. By the time we get to the 1980s, the Kalinago, who had been sensitized to what was happening to indigenous peoples, they decided to dub the area a territory. And I should mention too that one of the chiefs, the man who became the chief in the early 80s, he went to school in the US, and he had lived with a professor who did research on Caribs. So his name was Professor Einhorn out of Yale University. And this man, his name is Hilary Frederick. He came back to Dominica and had this having been sensitized to what the indigenous peoples of North America were facing. He started a movement for greater assertion of their identity, and pushing for more rights, and a review of the Carib Act. These are some things that he promoted.
Which is great. And then again, I know that you mentioned you alluded to this to before in one of your answers, but could you just describe in terms of the Kalinago territory, in terms of, of course, its geography, the structure, and of course the governance?
Right. Well, in terms of geography, it's equivalent to about 5 square miles. Dominica has an area of, sometimes it says 289 square miles. Other times you see it as 305 square miles. So they're pretty close. But anyway, that's about the size. So they have a very small part of the island. It's all of that 3,700 acres is held in common. There's one title. There's no private property in that area, and it's pretty much covered by forests. Most of the land is forests, and it goes pretty far up into the interior. And then they also are bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on one side, and then there's a major river called the Pegua River, which is one of the boundaries of the territory. And they also boundary with some villages on the other end. So but they do have an Atlantic coast, and that's important for their livelihood because they are seafarers historically, and being on the Atlantic, even though they were pushed from the Caribbean coast, which is the calmer Caribbean coast with sandy beaches, on the Atlantic is very rocky. So, but they've lived there for hundreds of years now. Yeah.
So then this then goes into again my next question of how has the Kalinago Council worked to preserve cultural practices while engaging in modern governance and development?
Right. Well, in your previous question, you had asked a little bit about the governance, and I can just go into that. They the council is governed by the council and the chief, who chairs the council, and they are able to make a lot of decisions about allocation of land, and also disputes around land issues in the territory, because there are sometimes disputes. As I said, there's no private property there. However, the way they determine the value of land is based on the crops that's on it.
Okay.
So if there are 10 coconut trees, they have some assessment of what that would cost, and then whatever other crops are on it. And so if let us say a family who used to work such plot of land is no longer doing that, then another family could ask the council to transfer it to them. And if there are some crops on it, long-term crops, then they would the family who would be acquiring that plot would simply pay the family who had crops on it. That's how they do that. The council is the sole allocator of land, and they are the stewards of all of the resources of the territory is in their hands. Now, they are a local government authority. However, they have never implemented any form of taxation of their people. So they depend strictly on transfers from central government to do projects in their communities. And they are allowed to raise funds, raise funding, and they've over the years they've gotten funding from outside Dominica.
And then, so what are the Kalinago people doing in terms of preserving or revitalizing their language, tradition, and of course, cultural identity?
Right. Well, on the question of the language, they have not made a lot of progress in bringing back the language, although there is a group that's working on that. And I know that there is a Kalinago man who has a program on radio where he speaks, you know, phrases in Kalinago language. And I think there's that aspiration to bring the language back. And because they have built relations with indigenous people in South America who speak the language, there's the possibility that cultural exchanges could help in terms of helping to bring the language. But I should say that they've had an interest in getting the language spoken again. In terms of the other cultural attributes there's some things that irrespective of how long the colonization has gone on, there are a number of characteristics of their life that has continued unaffected totally. Like, for example, they have the skill of making canoes. They've always made canoes going back, and they are seafarers. So Dominica has the type of forest where you can get huge trees. In fact, they not only does Dominica's forest provide these things for them, to like trees that they can use to make boats. I should mention that Dominica has a unique ethnobotany because the Kalinagos made several voyages back and forth to South America from 1200 to now. Well, not now; they don't do it anymore. But in that first 200 years, up to the time when Columbus came, they would go back and forth to South America and bring plants from South America, from the Amazon to Dominica. So Dominica has a unique set of plant life. A lot of it mirrors what you have in the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only island that has that, because St. Vincent doesn't have that, because they were physically removed from St. Vincent in 1795. But so Dominica has a unique kind of forest resources. And where they are on the 5 square miles of land that they have, which is about 3,700 acres, as I said, it's largely covered with trees, very dense forest. And I mean, even in their land, they have wild pigs, for example, which historically they have always hunted wild pigs with bow and arrow because that's been their weapon.
Yes.
Yeah. So we get to the 1980s, soon after independence. And then that's when the movement for Kalinago identity and rights began to blossom. And the government didn't like that. At the time, the Prime Minister, Mary Eugenia Charles, she pointed a finger at Save the Children, saying that we were the ones who were radicalizing them and putting ideas about territorial integrity and wanting to link them with other indigenous people and make them think they're different. So the government took sort of a hostile stance towards them and the council. But that did not stop the advocates in the Kalinago territory who were pushing for a greater awareness of their distinct ethnicity. The government had the view that all Dominicans are the same and there's no difference. There's no ethnic difference. But I took a strong position to say, no, they are different people and we have to treat them differently. And for that, the government eventually closed Save the Children. They just wouldn't renew our agreement or country agreement with them. And so Save the Children left. And that was a huge loss to the Kalinagos. But in that time, I should tell you, Wendy, that there was a lot of work done with the Kalinago Council, Save the Children and the Kalinago Council, in terms of cultural recuperation. So things like their baskets, which is another major attribute that they've been making baskets for centuries. They still make the same baskets. And if you go to Brazil, to northern Brazil, or even in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, you'll find shops that have indigenous craft and you'll see similar baskets still being made in Brazil and Dominica. So that is one of the most distinct attributes, their baskets. And that is the one item that even the larger Dominican population embraces. As far as the canoes, unless you're a fisherman, it wouldn't be of great interest. But what Save the Children did in the 1980s when we were there was to make having Kalinago basket fashionable. And many of the secretaries in Dominica in the different offices, it caught on. Everybody had a Kalinago basket, and so we were working. Our plan was to build a museum there. And one of the first things we did as part of the cultural recuperation was to build a longhouse, Kalinago Longhouse, which is where all the meetings, the community events were held. It's called a cabe. It was built about 1987. It was a long building. It was like 100 feet long, maybe by 100 feet by about 30 to 40 feet wide. A huge structure, wooden and covered with shingles, wood shingles. It was really a beautiful building. Unfortunately, after Save the Children left, one of the families close to where it was, they were clearing land using fire, and some of the cinders, the wind blew it into the building, and it caught the building on fire, and that building burnt. But in addition to that, so that was one of the things that Save the Children did. But we also built smaller buildings using Kalinago architectural design. Kalinago architectural style factors in hurricanes. They are built to withstand hurricanes. And one of the things that's not well known in Dominica is that a lot of the Catholic church buildings on Dominica adopted the Kalinago architectural style, which is basically an A-frame. The core aspect of a Kalinago building is that it's an A-frame. And A-frames deflect the winds very well. So they understood that, and their buildings were made with thatch. So they built thatch buildings using A-frame style. And one of the things that first struck me, Wendy, when I went to live there, because I had not been to the Kalinago territory as a child, as a boy. But when I came back from university on vacation, I think I was working on my graduate degree then, I said I must visit there. Mm-hmm. And you won't believe what happened later. When I made that visit, I met the then founding director of the office. And he told me that their plan was to hire a Dominican to lead that program. And he said, after talking to me, he said he thinks I would be a good person to play that role. And he did mention my name to the headquarters. So they contacted me and they told me that position was going to open and they wanted me to apply, and I did, and I got the job. And so I am, the first Dominican who worked in that role. And also, I should tell you that the relationship between the black Dominicans or the African Dominicans and the Kalinago, there have been problems. And a lot of these problems have to do with land and the boundaries of their land. They feel that African Dominicans have encroached on their lands, and African Dominicans may also have been discriminating towards them.
Mm.
And there were a lot of derogatory terms that were used to describe Kalinago people, that they drink a lot of alcohol, that they're not very intelligent, and all of that. Of course, part of it is these are all the stereotypes that came from the Europeans, which the black Dominicans adopted. But I should mention, though, Dominica had during the period of slavery, Dominica had a strong runaway slave movement called the Maroons, like in Jamaica. And the Maroons ran away from the plantations, and they were pretty much harbored by the Kalinago people and taught the forest by the Kalinago people. So there was a lot of cooperation between the Kalinago people and the Maroons back in the slavery era. And of course, there are a lot of things that we came to learn about the Kalinago culture, and one of them is traditional medicine. They have been major guardians of traditional medicine methods, and to this day they practice some of that. Of course, they lost their religion and their language, but they have held on to some attributes that remain to this day. So their knowledge of plants. There's a book that I've been looking for many years. It's called The Ethnobotany of the Island Caribs of Dominica, which is written by probably the most prolific writer on the Dominica Caribs, called Douglas Taylor. He wrote a lot, and this one book on the ethnobotany is really a catalog of the plants on Dominica, and it links that to the Amazon, links their thing. So that book is written by him and a botanist called Hodge, last name Hodge. And that book was out of print for a long time, but it was published in 1959. The other thing I should mention is that the the American government got interested in the Kalinagos at the turn of the last century, and they sent an anthropologist, that man I mentioned, Douglas Taylor. He made the first visit to Dominica in 1930, and he wrote a book called The Caribs of Dominica, which is quite a very good work.
Mm-hmm.
And it was for the Smithsonian.
Okay.
And in that book, he's also he had a penchant for graphics, so he did a lot of sketches. So there's sketches of the baskets, there's sketches of the canoes that they built. He has a set of photos that you can only find these photos in the archives of the Smithsonian, the National Museum archives. So I have gone to see those photos, and one of the things we're hoping that we will do is to get copies for the future museum of the Kalinago peoples.
Yeah, that would be fantastic to have that
Yeah,
available.
yeah. There actually two sets of photos in the Smithsonian archives. One set taken by Douglas Taylor in 1930, and then there's another set by two photographers who visited from the U.S. in the 1950s, early 50s, and both sets are in the Smithsonian. Unfortunately, the Caribs have not seen those photos. Although in Douglas Taylor's book, there are some of the photos are published in the book, but very few of them have seen the book. So, yeah.
Yes, and just on a side note, I mean, a lot of things that are originally in the Caribbean are elsewhere as well. So this is another type of conversation that
Yeah.
a lot of people are having at the moment. But I just wanted to go back in terms of the current population of the Kalinago people in Dominica, and how has that changed over time to what now is represented of the individuals now?
Yes, very good question. They well, one of the challenges of Dominica is that the last census,
Mhm.
which would have been done about 2010, I believe, has never been officially published. Public consumption. The government, for some reason, never understood why, but they've not. But from talking to the Kalinago chief, I'm told that the population is about 3,006, 7 or 700, somewhere in that. So it's under 4,000 for sure. What is interesting, as I mentioned earlier, at the turn of the last century, there are only about 200 of them left. But over that period, let's say we approaching 100 years since the
Mhm.
territory was established. Well, no, no, I'm thinking of when the 1930 happened. But anyway, they they had a higher birth rate than the rest of the Dominican population. So the Dominican population growth was about 1.6% for maybe for the last 30 years or 40 years. The Kalinago's birth rate was just about 6%. And that is why their population grew from 230 to what it is today. And factor in small amounts of migration. They don't really migrate too much to other islands or to other countries, but there's a small number that has migrated. But for the most part, they have been in the territory. Now, I should mention that besides the territory where one can say this is where the Kalinagos live,
Mhm.
but that's somewhat of a misnomer because there are a number of communities outside this territory that are Kalinago, nearby villages, predominantly Kalinago. They might be mixed more with African, but it's only when they began to assert their um, their identity as indigenous people in the 80s that people who normally would not admit that they have Kalinago ancestry began to to claim that they have Kalinago ancestry, and now it's more fashionable to say I'm part Kalinago. So one of the things that the chief is doing is reaching out to what I call the Kalinago diaspora in Dominica, because outside the Salibia, where they live,
Mhm.
where the majority of them live, there was a lot of discrimination towards them by the larger population. And so the people who have Kalinago ancestry outside the territory did not want to associate or to be known to have that ancestry. But that has changed quite a bit from the 80s to now.
Because I mean, I guess it had a kind of like a negative connotation until the last couple of years or so, would you say?
Yes, well, the Europeans had left a very nasty perspective about Kalinagos, saying that they were cannibals,
Yes.
and the word Carib is linked to that notion of cannibal. That, of course, it's an area that I don't get into because I simply say
Yes.
these are things that were said about them. I don't know. It's possible that they may have done human sacrifice, back in going way back, and the Europeans, one or two Europeans may have witnessed that and said that they eat people, and
Yes.
I've seen things about how the Europeans said that the Caribs had a propensity to like French meat as opposed to English meat. That kind of, so there have been some really derogatory things said about them, right?
Yes,
But yeah.
no, I'm just saying, just in general, just for a lot of indigenous populations, this is it seems like the template or the standard is to kind of lambaste them in generalized fashions, just like this.
Yes, yes. But
And
I think they themselves have made a lot of progress to the point where, imagine, Wendy, when I was working there in 1984 is when I went to work there.
Mm.
They were at first they were very skeptical of me being an African Dominican. They didn't trust. They didn't trust African Dominicans for a number of reasons. But I had to prove myself to them that, well, first of all, I come from sort of a left wing orientation. I've always supported their independence and their self determination. So they quickly understood where I was coming from. And I would say, without any fear of contradiction, that I'm one of the few African Dominicans that they have embraced and seen as an ally. And
Mhm.
that's been going on from 1980s to now.
Yeah, definitely. And because trust is built, it's not just automatically given. And with
That's
your
right.
past,
Yes.
I can definitely see and relate as to why, it would have taken time for your trust to be respected. And so
Yeah.
what do you believe, I guess, for, taken that needs to be taken by the Dominican government, of course, CARICOM or other international organizations to really support the indigenous sovereignty and the rights in Dominica?
Right. Well, I think the most important thing for the government to do is to do an update of the law governing the relationship between the government and the Kalinago people, which is the Carib Act, to revise that totally and bring it in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007. I happened to be the ambassador of Dominica at that time, and I was very active with the Kalinagos, probably not only with the Kalinagos, with the global indigenous peoples.
Mm.
And I probably was the ambassador who was most in their corner at the time. And when the declaration came to the floor of the General Assembly, some of the major countries that have indigenous people did not vote for the declaration, like United States and Canada and Australia and maybe New Zealand. They did not they did not vote for it. I don't remember how the UK voted, but I know that the US and Canada were opposed to the declaration. They later on, in subsequent years, they changed their position. Like the US, it was under President George W. Bush, that they he was the president then. That's the second Bush. He didn't support it, but when President Barack Obama became the president, he reversed that, and then the U.S. supported, and then Canada fell in line, and so did Australia. I should say that in the negotiations for the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, I happen to be the lucky person to be the organizer and facilitator of that whole process, and just to watch, or just to facilitate the oppressors of the indigenous people now sitting on the other side of the table from the indigenous peoples, who were for the first time accorded this opportunity to state their position and how they would like the rest of the world and the United Nations to engage with them. Of course, the UN is a state-centric entity, and the states never accorded the indigenous people any real rights. They tolerated them, but when it came to the question of their rights, that was never on the front burner. But the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was negotiated for a period of 35 years. And it just happened that when it was at the UN, that's when it reached its final stage. I think, so going back to your question, what should the government of Dominica do? They should update the Kalinago Act. They should give more autonomy to the Kalinago Council to be really in charge of the territory and not have to be reporting to a minister, for them to exercise the authority of the council as far as management of their lands and the delimitation of their lands. And then I think that to allow them, and I don't think there's any problem now, to allow them to freely link up with other indigenous peoples around the world. And that is something I don't think that that's even a negotiable thing from the government standpoint. The Kalinagos are doing that anyway,
Yeah,
and continue to enjoy partnership with many other indigenous organizations.
absolutely. And, Mr. Gregoire, we should be able to, what do you think is the hope that for the younger generation of the Kalinago people to kind of look for? Like, what gives you the hope that that they will continue?
Well, Wendy, one of the most important developments to note in the 40 years that I have been associated with them, I think it's 40 years, I have seen their skill set really improve to the extent that when I started working there were no Kalinago doctors, for example.
Okay. Okay.
Today, the two chief surgeons at the hospital in the capital city of Dominica are Kalinago surgeons. And there are many Kalinago professionals, doctors, lawyers, other professions. So they have really made some significant strides.
Hmm.
And one of the things that has contributed to that is the government that was in power from 1995 to 2000 introduced universal secondary education so that all children from Dominica from then have been going to high school. We didn't have that. When I was going to school, high school, there were only 4 high schools, and maybe very few Kalinagos completed secondary education because the places was a very competitive exam and limited number of places from the 4 high schools that we had at the time. But that has changed completely. So now all Kalinagos go to high school. And that has contributed to them pursuing higher education. The other thing I should mention is that the University of the West Indies has also granted a special arrangement for Kalinagos to get scholarships to the university. But where the real impact is as far as post-secondary training for them has been from Cuba. The government of Cuba has made scholarships available to them. And in fact, the first doctor who was trained, medical doctor, was trained in Cuba. He's today a dermatologist and on Dominica. And so they have their professional achievements have been commendable.
Yes.
And it continues. So they begin to see education as an avenue to better life, to better jobs and so on. So there's that yearning for that. So that's one thing. I think that what the council needs to do now is to put in place a program for youth orientation outside school. Because up to this day, when the Kalinago history is not taught in the schools, and that's a big deficiency in the school system. In that, especially when it comes to civics, there's no course in the high school on the Kalinagos. They study a little bit in Caribbean history, but a lot of the things I'm telling you there, most people don't know about these things. Most
Exactly.
Kalinagos
Exactly.
don't know, and then the rest of Dominica still don't know. They're even worse off. So I think that the knowledge, the curriculum must reflect the tremendous role that they've played. And the fact that they're still on in Dominica we need much more inquiry. I'm one of the few African Dominicans who have actually written on them. And the other person who has written on them his name is Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, who is one of Dominica's historians. But he is of English ancestry. He's not well, I mean, he was born in Dominica, and I value his work. But I think the Kalinagos need to make the next level of achievement, and that they need to start writing their own story. We haven't reached that point, but I think we're approaching that point.
Yes, once you control the narrative of your story, things things remain in them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We the After Save the Children was shut down in 1989 by the government. Those of us who were leading the office, we formed an organization called Development Alternatives, and I started writing before the about that time. I started writing about the Dominic Caribs, and we launched a Carib cultural revitalization project, and part of that was to interview Caribs who over the age of 70. So we did a lot of interviews with a number of them. And then we started to document that from the interviews. We actually transcribed the text of the interviews. And we did a second work. I did the University of the West Indies published a book. It's an anthology, and it's not that work is not well known because it's in an anthology, but it's called the Carifuna, the Caribs of Dominica, and it was the Institute of Social and Economic Research of the University of the West Indies was the one who commissioned that work, and it's over 100 pages, and it's quite a detailed study of them back then. That was published about 1994, 95. I'm continuing to do research. I'm actually working on something that looks at the Kalinago people from 1900 to present. And I spent some time last year in the British Archives, although I'm working on another book that's not related to the Kalinago,
Okay.
but that one has to do with the southern part of the island where the people launched a revolution back in 1974 and took over the plantation. And so I'm writing the history of that one. I actually witnessed it, but I'm also at the same time looking at the writing something significant on the Kalinago.
Okay. No, perfect. Because maybe you might come on again and talk about what you're writing for that one. But I will link anything that you've indicated here in the show
Yeah.
in the show notes, so people can be able to reference those and start
Okay.
looking for their own. Okay.
The other thing that we had worked on during the Save the Children period was this notion of an eco museum, a living museum for them. And I had a consultant in museum development come from Colombia to spend some time with us, and then to come up with a set of recommendations of how we could proceed to do a museum in an era where we don't have many artifacts, because they were constantly on the move. The Europeans, the British they moved from first of all they moved from the west coast, which is the Caribbean sea coast, to the hostile Atlantic coast. So they don't have that many artifacts, but we felt that we could do a museum, getting them to make things for the museum, like their baskets, for example, their canoes, their traditional medicine. That museum would have like herbal gardens,
Yeah.
for example. It would have baskets. It would have and it would have photos. Now that's one of the things we did. We have tremendous photo archives. And some of that, I'm a photographer myself, and I took a lot of photos of them, and a lot of that was done in slides. So we have a lot of material from that period going forward. So the government, however, sometime maybe in the 90s, they built a quasi museum space. It's called the Barana Orte. And that is where, you can see aspects of their culture. Like, for example, cassava making, which is their major food, how that is processed, that's being made right there. It's a place where you can go and visit and learn about their life. And so it's a good start, but it's not the type of museum I'm thinking is a museum that would have the kind of documentation that captures a lot of what has been written about them. fact, I started part of our project was to establish a repository for what has been published on them. And so we are still collecting stuff, but we did come up with a bibliography that we developed back then, and we sought to collect a lot of these journal articles and books that have been written on them. So there's that. Yeah.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. And, Mr. Gregoire, if there's one thing that you could communicate to the global audience about the Kalinago people and their story, what would it be?
I would say that they're one of the most resilient people I've met. Tremendously resilient in many ways. They first of all, they have survived how to live in a terrain where you have hurricanes. They just the architectural style tells you that they were very focused on how to survive hurricanes. So that's one thing. The other thing is that they're totally self-sufficient. They don't need to leave the territory to go to the Rosa, and they never did that before. It's only now because a lot of them have become professionals and they seek work outside the territory. But they can be a totally self-sufficient people. And having this large tract of land, because in the age when plantations declined in the last, since slavery, they have the largest tract of land on Dominica, bigger than any plantation that we ever had. I mean, they have almost 4,000 acres of land. The largest plantation was about 16 to 1,700 acres.
Mm.
So they have a significant piece of land. Maybe the British didn't see that piece of land as important, but today it's an important piece because they have forests, they have water on their land. They have more than one river, for example. One is quite big. And then they have significant forest cover. And so and then their food. We didn't get into their cuisine, but of course cassava being a major part, but there are other things that they eat. And the their culture is very much intertwined with the rest of Dominica. So you can't speak of a Dominica without talking about the Kalinago people. Their imprint is there, even though their numbers are small, because they're less than, I think they're about 5% of the population. But they're a significant community with great interest from people from outside. Because it's not, no other island has what we have in terms of a distinct community governed by the Kalinago people themselves. They have the title for their lands as a communal land tenure. I think they have a future. And, people who were writing at the turn of the last century were saying whether they would survive into the 21st century. And they have survived in the 21st century. And I can say that they're probably going to be there for at least another century.
Yes, definitely. And, Mr. Gregoire, as we close this episode, how can those of us in the Caribbean and, of course, in the diaspora, engage more meaningful in the solidarity with the Kalinago people and other indigenous communities within the Caribbean?
Yes, well, I think that the people in the Caribbean need to embrace them. I mean, we are multi-ethnic region now. I mean, post-slavery, the Europeans brought in people from India, from China, from Madeira. So, but and the indigenous people they were thought of having disappeared and wiped out. Well, that's not the case. We still have remnants of them, but the Dominica has the strongest presence. And I think that the people of the Caribbean must put pressure on their governments to to teach about these people in the history books, because the history of the Caribbean still talks about Columbus discovered the Caribbean, and we still have this Eurocentric view of the Caribbean. And I think it's time that we begin to explain to the younger generation that the Caribbean is a multi-ethnic society that includes indigenous peoples.
Yes.
That is very important because the belief is that the indigenous peoples don't exist anymore, and they're very much alive.
Exactly.
And they have left their imprint on the culture of the region. So, and I think the most important thing is that they're resilient people. They stood up to colonial conquest, and they made sure that they carved a space for themselves, even while the colonials were expanding in the region.
Exactly. Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more on that. And, the narrative does need to change and it does need to be broadened in terms of what is being said out there. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Mr. Gregoire, for coming onto the podcast, speaking about the Kalinago people, as I learned so much and definitely appreciate your time and efforts for this. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.